I'm Judy Cole, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this web production of the MIT Alumni Association.
Hello and welcome to the MIT Faculty Forum Online Alumni Edition for April 29th, 2016. I'm Wade Roush, Outreach Officer at the Program in Science, Technology, and Society at MIT, and your fellow MIT alum. Our topic this month is autonomous vehicles. So whether in space or underwater or on the roads, research on self-driving vehicles, as everyone knows, has been getting an increasing number of headlines over the last few years. At MIT, there's research in AeroAstro, EECS, CSAIL, the Media Lab, the Center for Transportation, and other places where researchers are thinking about autonomous vehicles from various points of view. Those include the technical and design and ethical and policy perspectives, of course. And in the past year, we've seen news coming out of MIT on autonomous taxis, rovers, drones, tractors, pontoon boats. Last week there was even a fleet of ducky cabs in the news. But as exciting as all of these developments may be, I think there are still big questions to be dealt with about whether and how we can get from the present world, where most cars are under human control almost all the time, to some kind of possibly utopian future where vehicles are mostly or fully autonomous. Now, in 2014, more than 32,000 people were killed in traffic accidents in the United States. And there are arguments that reducing that kind of horrifying fatality rate is the single best argument for implementing full autonomy in our cars. And that's indeed the goal announced this week by a new coalition of companies, including Google, Ford, Volvo, Uber, and Lyft. And even Mothers Against Drunk Driving have come out in favor of this sort of ideal of a fully autonomous car. But the transition period between the present we're in now and that utopian future is the tricky part, and perhaps the dangerous part. Because the danger is we could get stuck kind of halfway there with semi-autonomous vehicles that lull drivers into a sense of being safe. And then suddenly, in an emergency, the driver gets control back and may or may not be prepared to take over instantly and respond correctly. So that's kind of one of the questions I think that we'll probably see come up in the conversation today. And we hope you'll involve yourself by sending us your own questions. So this is an interactive forum. There's a Google form right below the video window, and that's where you can send us questions, and I'll see them pop up on my computer here, and I can pass them on to our panelists. You can also tweet today to hashtag MIT alum, and we'll see questions coming in that way. So with no further ado, let me introduce our distinguished panelists today. We're very pleased to have with us Donald Norman, class of 1957 at MIT with a Bachelor's of Science in EECS, and now Director of the Design Lab at UCSD. And we also have with us a much more recent graduate, Swarun Kumar, 2012 Master's and 2016 PhD from EECS. And Swarun now is an assistant professor in electrical and computer engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. So I'm going to first go to Don Norman in San Diego and ask Don to fill us in about what he's working on these days, perhaps with an emphasis on how your work, Don, relates to this big question of autonomy and how far we can get and how fast.
Thanks, Wade. Hi, everyone. Let me, though, extend that bio slightly because it's highly relevant. Yes, I'm an EE graduate, course 6 at MIT. Have a master's in EE from University of Pennsylvania, but then I kind of switched. So my PhD is in psychology. And my first teaching position at Harvard, and then I went to UC San Diego before many of you were born, before the university actually had graduated any students, in the psychology department. And I was chair of psychology, and then I started the cognitive science department and was chair of it until I took it to early retirement and went up to Apple and became vice president of advanced technology. Now, all of that's relevant because it means I have a deep understanding of technology and also a deep understanding of human beings. And that's the crux of the discussion we're going to have today. I had retired from UC San Diego. Later on, I was in the computer science department at Northwestern. I retired from it. I was called out of retirement mainly to come back to San Diego and start an exciting new design lab. We're competing with the media lab, you see. And one of the major activities is automation. So I'm working with several of the major manufacturers of automatic vehicles, and I've driven in most of the major companies' automobiles. And let me tell you, the technologists think it's a technology problem, and I say no. Yeah, there are still some technology hurdles, but the real issue is the human problem. And you'll hear more about that as we go on.
Fantastic, Don. Thanks for the introduction. And now I'd like to let Swarun Kumar at Carnegie Mellon fill us in about, Swarun, what are you up to these days? And perhaps you could briefly fill us in about some of your work for your PhD or earlier on car navigation and sensing the environment.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Swarun Kumar. I'm a recent graduate from MIT's PhD program. I just got out late last year, and I'm now an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon. My main focus is on wireless networking, but I've applied my research in the context of autonomous systems, multi-robot systems, vehicular networks, and these have been the platforms that I've worked on in principle. So I have a few slides to just share my thoughts on this space and on my research in general. So, I mean, and in CMU in particular, I hope you're seeing the slides.
Yes, we are.
There's been teams here working on the DARPA Urban Challenge, on their autonomous cars. There's been interest from Google and various different companies that Don mentioned. And beyond autonomous cars alone, I'd like to broaden the discussion to also talk about robotic systems and autonomous robotic systems, where, again, the goal is to operate as autonomously as possible to perform tasks other than driving, picking up objects, and so on. If you look at autonomous cars in particular, there's benefits of lower congestion, more productivity, and of course billions of dollars of savings, which the exact figures might be disputed, but there's definitely agreement that there are savings because of lower congestion and improved safety. That is the hope. And the year when autonomous cars will be out there, I've heard numbers ranging from 2020 to never, but at least going with the lineup of the folks that I've talked to industry, at least semi-autonomous cars are being slated for as early as next year, ranging from 2020, where I think most of these companies will have some form of autonomous / semi-autonomous cars on the road. And what I think wouldn't happen maybe like 4 years ago when I started working in this space was the policy direction. That's been changing dramatically. There have been a bunch of states that have started legalizing at least some form of testing of autonomous cars. There have been countries that have had testing of autonomous cars on their roads, and I think this is a direction that's moving very quickly. And now talking about my work, I look at the intersection of wireless and autonomous systems. Where can wireless and robotics and vehicular research that looks at autonomous systems intersect from at least from a technology point of view? And of course, the natural space is communication, but there are also interesting ramifications of using wireless networking for sensing and also security systems. So I'm just going to show you a couple of quick videos, which I hope will then raise questions from your side on where wireless can help autonomous systems. So here's one. So here is one obvious solution, right, which is communication. So here we have a bunch of sensors that we've deployed and other cars on the streets. And there's going to be a person emerging from a blind spot here, and there's an autonomous car on the street. And what we're going to see is this autonomous car, using its own onboard sensors, cannot detect the person in the blind spot. But if you have very quick communication between different sensors on the road and between vehicles themselves, you can quickly make sure that the autonomous cars stop. And this is, as you can see, there's no driver in this particular car. And this was actually an experiment and a project that we worked on while I was at MIT in collaboration with Singapore, the government of Singapore and NUS. So moving on, there's a second application, which is navigation. So here I have two robots, and the robot on the left is trying to move to the robot on the right. But what's interesting is that the robot doesn't have onboard sensors. It's just using its wireless signals. So notice here how the robot turns around the obstacle. It doesn't know that the obstacle was there in the first place. It's purely navigating based on wireless signal reflections. It's sensing where wireless signals are coming from and then navigating towards the car. And so where this might apply for autonomous vehicles on the road is if you have, again, vehicles in blind spots that you cannot track, or if you have poor weather conditions, can you help, can you use the wireless radios that are on the cars to help sense different objects in the environment? And a third domain that I'm interested in is security. So here is an example of autonomous aerial vehicles. So where the autonomous aerial vehicle is trying to provide some form of communication service to these different client vehicles on the road. But what you can do is we can have some of these ground vehicles spoof or create fake robots that are in other locations, and as a result, it can draw away some of the UAV away from the genuine clients. And so what we've built is systems which can secure robots using wireless signals. So I've given you 3 different examples in communication, sensing, and security, but I think there's definitely much more research that can be done in this space. And I'm happy to answer any questions about these systems and about autonomous vehicles more in general. Right? Thank you.
Great, Swarun. Thank you so much. So those are great introductions. I'm going to lob a question at you guys that is a question I had, but it's also coming in from one of our viewers, Ralph in Milan.
But you know, maybe I could respond to Swarun just to start it off.
Sure.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Don.
Because Swarun mentioned 3 important points. And but you know, Swarun, you remind me of all the technologists I work with who think it's a technology problem. It isn't. I repeat, technology is important, but it's not sufficient. So look, first of all, you said people are promising fully autonomy by 2020. That's stupid, absolutely stupid, because it's now 2016. And if you look at how long it takes to get a car out there, it means by 2017 the car actually has to be fully designed. And the only company that makes claims like this is Tesla. And Tesla doesn't understand what they're talking about because, as far as I can tell, it's a technology-driven company. And if you take a look at Ford and Toyota and Nissan, who are much more cautious, they're not making those claims. So for semi-autonomy, well, we have that today. I have friends who already drive their cars 20 or 30 minutes on like Highway 101, which is a very difficult highway in Silicon Valley, without touching anything. Now the computer doesn't, you know, the car says, oh no, your hand should be on the steering wheel. So they touch the steering wheel just enough to give them another few minutes before they have to touch it again. That's crazy, by the way, because people tell me they love their Tesla. They can drive a long time and it's relaxing and they've never had an incident. And I say, look, the United States drives several trillion miles a year. And so if you tell me that you haven't had any incident, that's meaningless. We kill 30,000 people a year and 1 million are injured. So that's problem 1. So it's a long way before we get that death rate down. That's the point. Problem 2, wireless. Well, sure, but tell me this. You get across the street and here comes a car without a driver and there's a bunch of you, 8 of you, 9 of you. How do you know that you can cross the street? Or how do you wave it on? And for that matter, how does it wave you on? And if it waves you on, how do you know it's waved you on and not, how do you know it's seen you? So that maybe it waved the other 2 people on, but it didn't see you. So wireless is absolutely a fundamental part of the solution, and it allows things like you talked about, detecting things that are otherwise invisible. But wow, there's a long way to go. And finally, security, I'm really glad you raised that because it's an interesting, most of the car manufacturers don't spend much time thinking about malevolent people and the difficulties there. So that's really critical.
Well, I think that, Don, you're absolutely right to dive immediately into the sort of social, ethical, psychological sort of conundrums that would have to be figured out along the way. But my question to Swarun was kind of going to be, okay, let's set those questions aside for a second. You're talking about some amazing progress just in the last few years on sensing and model building, and this kind of capability wouldn't have even been imaginable 10 years ago. So I guess my question to you was, just if you look just at the technical parts, how realistic are some of these predictions, do you think, about how soon we'll have autonomous vehicles or partially autonomous vehicles on the market? And that's a question that has come in from a couple of our readers as well.
Yeah, but you can't just look at the technical parts. That's the whole point.
I completely agree. I agree with Don on that it's wrong to just look at the technical aspects. In fact, there's one big question that needs to be answered, which is the policy aspect. Forget about the corner cases and the technical aspects. Forget about everything else. But are we sure that governments will move to open this up? Will there be policy? If there's a car crash, for example, who's responsible, right? Who's liable? What will be the legal framework? What will be the how do you actually objectively evaluate the safety of these systems without getting them out there? So there are a bunch of different questions that need to be answered. To be honest, when I started out working on this research, I was an autonomous vehicle pessimist because I thought this is never going to be answered. But what really is sort of changed my mind over the years is the amount of progress that I've seen on the technical front, and even some progress that I've seen from governments who are sort of and technology companies and so on, who've and even vehicle manufacturers who are realizing that the technology is going rapidly improving, and so there is scope. And if we don't develop our own technology, if we don't answer some of these policy questions, then we're going to be left behind, and some other country or some other company is going to achieve it before we do. So I think I think the way I see it is it's hard to pin down a year. As Don mentioned, if you look at semi-autonomous technology, some semi-autonomous aspects of cars, like being able to stop before, if there's a car that brakes suddenly in front of you, then being able to stop your own vehicle. Some of these systems are already in place in some of the cars today. So I don't think there's going to be one day where you see fully autonomous vehicles pop up and there will be no autonomy until then. So there will be a gradual inculcation of more of these features into cars, and at some point we'll have a car that is increasingly more autonomous. Now, questions of how will that influence human behavior, if they are lulled into a sense of security, questions about what does this mean about liability, what does this mean for liability, what does this mean in terms of policies, in terms of legislation. I think these are questions that are beyond my expertise, but from the technology point of view, I'd see sensing as increasingly getting more powerful, more reliable, so on the technology front, we are making rapid progress. From 5 years ago to today, we've seen a lot of progress.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know, was whether the technology is really advancing fast enough that we have to get thinking about the policy issues now. And you're saying yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I think that we need to establish that. So, okay, the next question is, how do we come up with those policies? Who should be talking about this? Are the right people at the right levels thinking about issues like who would be responsible for legally in an accident where that was instigated by an autonomous vehicle? And this relates to a question coming in from a listener, Berling at MIT, who asks, over the next several years, how should policies be implemented to most effectively allow for the integration of autonomous vehicles into society while also minimizing risk due to uncertainty? So who wants to help us dive into that?
Let me comment.
Please.
First of all, I don't think policy issues are the big ones. The issue of blame, our legal system is really good at settling it out. At first, it's going to be contentious, but we have lots of other situations where we have autonomous vehicles. We have autonomous elevators, okay? We have all sorts of autonomy, and we take care of it. So basically, I think what's going to happen is that, first of all, when we have full autonomy, it's going to be easier because the cars will have to be certified. And when a car is certified and passed the tests, if something malfunctions with a car, and it's been demonstrated that actually it passed all of the appropriate tests, and I think the legal system has a way of dealing with that. You get the lawsuit saying, no, the design was faulty and the company knew about it, and then that's the sort of thing that plays out in the courts, and it makes a lot of press, but actually the number of incidents is relatively small. I really think this will be taken care of, and moreover, it'll be contentious forever, but if you look at the legal system, everything is contentious. You know, your coffee was too hot and you scalded me, and it was your fault. That was a real suit that played out, and so nowadays we don't get coffee as hot as we used to. But here's where the real issues are. For example, today in automation, if you have an automatic car, it's required by all of the states that have allowed it that you have a test driver. And the test driver is someone who's been trained and can take over when something goes wrong. Let me tell you, that's not possible. If you're driving at 60 miles an hour, in 1 second, you've gone 90 feet. And all the studies show it takes roughly 10 seconds before someone can really, what's happened? Oh, to figure out. Because if you've been driving along for a long time and the car hasn't required any assistance, you're not paying attention. If you look at the work in aviation, this is what happens all the time. Pilots are going along, something goes wrong, and they say, oh shit. And then it takes them minutes to figure out what to do. And these are highly trained people. And in the automobile, we have ill-trained people. But in the airplane, you're flying up about 5-6 miles, you have minutes, you have 5 minutes or more. And almost every case where this happens, they figure it out and they save the airplane. But in the automobile, 1 second, 90 feet. At 60 miles an hour, they may be going faster. Today, look, the safest part of driving and the easiest to automate is highway driving. And I think we will see complete automation of highway driving in the next year or two. I happen to know that some of the car companies are going to advertise and release this next year. Tesla tried, but their rear-looking sensors weren't good enough, and so they had to sort of withdraw it. But we're very, very close. And Tesla says Tesla's sensors are not as good as those of the other automobiles, simply because Tesla put the sensors in several years ago. Now they simply activated, so they aren't the latest sensors. That the real issue is going to be this mix. So for years I've argued this point. The dangerous part of automation is almost automation. When it's like 99%, that's what's dangerous, because then people simply can't take over. When it's partial automation, people are still paying attention. When it's almost there, people are lulled into a sense of security. So I think here's the real issue. When do we transition? See, I think that the difficult part is a transition. And most people say, well, look, 30,000 people a year killed, 1 million injured. When we can get the rates lower than that, we should transition. And although that's logically correct, I don't think the public will go for it. Because if you talk to the public, they think that airplanes are unsafe. And airplanes crash and kill 100 people in one crash. Oh my God, I'll never fly again. So they drive instead of flying, and guess what? The death rate in the country goes up because driving is far more dangerous than flying. And so suppose that we have fully automatic cars and the death rate plummets to 1,000 a year instead of 30,000. We would say hurrah, but no. When there's an accident, the cars will be traveling much closer, they'll be platooning. So it's often the case that one car has a problem and multiple cars are involved and maybe 50 people are killed. There'll be a public uproar that says, stop, we must pass legislation. And people will forget that it used to be 30,000 people a year, and now it's maybe 1,000. That's the hard part. That's right. The hard part.
Well, so Don, or Swarun, or both of you, when you talk about this transition and when to make it, I guess my question is a transition to what? A transition to a world of full autonomy, or to some medium level of autonomy where Is there any medium level of autonomy where we won't have this problem of suddenly shocking people when they are asked to take control of the vehicle? That's a serious problem.
Let me give a quick answer, then I'll let Swarun carry it on.
Right.
We are very close to the transition point because, as I say, in highway driving, we could switch over now. The difficulty, and we think we know the solutions, is when you get out of the highway, how do you wake up the driver and make sure they're going to take over? And if they don't, how do you pull over to the side safely? Because there are two kinds of automation. There's a kind of automation like we have in stability control and anti-skid braking, where the person is still driving. There's the kind of automation, though, that completely takes over, so you no longer have to pay attention to the road. And that's the dangerous type, because that's when we get complacency. So I have a feeling that in a few years, it might be time to do the switch, because what I want to do is avoid that last little part where it's 99% correct, but not fully. That's the dangerous part where the driver...
Well, Swarun, I mean...
but let Swarun, your turn.
Yeah, I mean, do you think we can get to that full autonomy ever? And like related to that, should we?
I think we should get to full autonomy. I agree with Don that if you have a system where you defer to the user, where, for example, again, talking about liability here, if the user, if the vehicle fails, then it's a responsibility of the user to take over and get the car under control. The user's not going to be able to react fast enough. The way I see it, and the way honestly, the only way fully autonomous cars can be sold, in my opinion, is if automobile manufacturers take full responsibility of anything that goes wrong with the car, and they have their system fully well understood. Now, if that's the goal, and if you want to really get there, what would be a reasonable transition point? Maybe, for example, if you have a car that can, if you have technology for cars that can self-park, for example. So you get close to the parking lot, and then you press a button, and from that point, the autonomous car takes over. It can park your car, or maybe potentially with highways, if the car can do cruise control and then make sure that it travels on the highway. But once there's a clear point when the autonomous car is in control, there's a clear point when the human is in control, but when the autonomous car is in control, it's not left to the human to rescue the car if something goes wrong. I think that's a reasonable model to go with. Are the cars that are going to be out there in a couple of years or a year going to have that guarantee provided? How are laws going to interoperate with what the autonomous car manufacturers guarantee? I think these are definitely interesting questions. I think with automation, there is definitely going to be the risk of failure that happen, of correlated failures. If there is, for example, this one well-known failure mode for cars, I mean, even if there are significantly fewer incidents, I completely agree with this. Even if there are significantly fewer incidents, even if there are just 1,000 accidents, but all those 1,000 incidents happen to occur at the same time, or around the same time, or because of the same cause, that creates a pattern, and that would make a lot of bad press for autonomous vehicles, and it would set things behind quite a bit. I completely agree with that risk.
Let me also mention a second point, which is in the transition period, we're going to have cars that are extremely capable, and they're going to have wireless car-to-car communication. We talk about vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure and vehicle-to-X, where X is a whole bunch of other things. But look at the range of age of cars on the road today. It's like 20 years. The newest cars versus the older cars, 10 to 20 years. And when we do that, we're going to have cars with very powerful wireless capability, vehicle-to-vehicle, vehicle-to-infrastructure capability, and autonomy. But we'll have cars that are driven by people. And we'll have cars that are only halfway automated. And we'll have cars that do not have the wireless, or that have an older version of the wireless that doesn't have the capabilities of the new. That's going to be dangerous. And don't forget the gaming. Hey, if I know that all those other cars are automated, then I can ignore them and just drive right through them, or I can just cross the street in front of them because I know they're programmed to stop. And that's going to be dangerous, because what if 3 people do that at the same time, or etc. So the transition is not just the technology, it's also the mix of competencies of all the vehicles.
Okay. Gentlemen, I'm not an engineer, so this is treading on thin ice for me, but I'm going to challenge both of you on the premise that that we can actually reach full autonomy, especially in environments like cities. That John Leonard, who's a professor here at MIT, has kind of joked that the city is like an extreme environment, right? It's like space or the deep ocean. It's the kind of environment where we may never actually figure out how to make cars competent enough to avoid sudden surprises. Skateboarders, construction. All of these situations that cars are having trouble navigating now may be things we just are too hard to figure out, right? And then, like, let's assume that that's not too hard to figure out. Well, let me just leave it there. What do you guys think? Is it possible to actually program cars that could drive through Harvard Square or Kendall Square safely?
Well, the car companies divide the terrain into at least three different levels. One of them is highway driving, which, as I say, is pretty much licked today. The second is sort of urban driving, but streets, normal streets, where there's maybe narrow lanes and cars coming out from at right angles from unexpected places, driveways, or even empty lots. We think we can handle that. But the hard one is the one you talk about, city streets. But let me tell you, city streets are where the accidents happen today. It's where so we're not going to have perfection, but nor do we have perfection today. We have kids running out from nowhere. We have people standing on the sidewalk, and it's very clear they're just standing and talking, and suddenly they change their mind and whoop, run across the street. And we have all sorts of unexpected things today. So this is going to be the really difficult thing, but here's what I predict. I predict that we're going to change people's behavior. When all the cars are autonomous, one of the nice things about it is we can predict what the car will do. And that means the pedestrians can predict. And I spent a lot of time in the last year in our research projects filming the skateboarders and filming the bicyclists and filming the animals and filming the running kids and filming all these people crossing the street, never once looking up from their cell phones. And in fact, they trip on the curbs, let alone get hit by cars, or they bump into each other. But we're never going to solve that. So what we have to do is get it to a level better than we have today. But let me mention one other problem. I've watched cars trapped. You're at a street corner, and all the pedestrians come and come and come and come, and you can't move. And in fact, you want to turn right, and the light is green, and now the light turns red, and you didn't manage to do it. And so what you need is aggression. If you watch real cars, they are aggressive. They push their way through. They signal. I watched a car in Mellon do it by going, Rum! It revved his engine several times, telling people, get out of the way. And so the automobile is going to have to signal too that, hey, I'm impatient, but I need to move forward. And it moves forward 6 inches, another 6 inches. And if you look at what happens in India, that's what they do all the time, or China. The culture is different across the world, which is also a difficult issue for the automation, that it has to be mildly aggressive, but it has to be aggressive in the way that is accepted by the culture. The culture at UC San Diego inside the campus is different than the culture in the city of La Jolla, just a few miles away, for the same people. The culture of New York is different than California. The culture of China is different than India. You have to make the same car manage to do it properly within the culture. So I think the hardest part is indeed the one you've signaled out. So, Swarun?
Let me also add to that. It's not all gloom and doom as far as city environment and urban environments are concerned. Because yes, on the one hand, human drivers are particularly are versatile, right? So they can deal with these people coming in and so on and so forth. Of course, they do struggle as well, right? When you have skateboarders, everyone struggles. Human driver struggles, autonomous cars would struggle. But there's something that autonomous cars can do which humans cannot, which is first, there's going to be B2 infrastructure, like Don mentioned. There's going to be when autonomous cars are going to be really out on the streets, cars can communicate with each other. Cars can communicate potentially with infrastructure on the streets. They can really know what's going to happen to traffic lights even before they get to the traffic lights. They can know about where there's congestion going on. They can know about if there are sensors that are off street, for example. They can know about pedestrians or other people who are coming in way before humans just physically can't. They physically can't know what's going to happen to traffic lights. They physically can't know what's beyond their line of sight. They have to react. They're compelled to react. But if you have enough sensors on the streets, if you have enough cars on the road which are autonomous, there is a lot of intelligent information sharing that you can facilitate with autonomous cars to improve their performance. So these are opportunities which we should be aware of at the same time as we are aware of the risks.
Right. I'm going to combine two different questions that have come in from the audience and kind of pitch them to you. So Ralph in Milan and Jeff in Boston are both asking, what are the potential problems that we'll run into when we have a mix of autonomous cars and non-autonomous vehicles on the road? You know, how can you deal with the mix of semi-autonomous cars, autonomous, and even different versions of different releases of software, right, on the same car?
Yep. That's an issue I already raised. So.
Yeah, in fact, that's
Swarun, what do you think?
Aggression definitely is one, right? You'll have, for example, stop signs. There a lot of people, me included, like we don't stop at the stop signs. Now, if you're making an autonomous car, forcing the autonomous car to stop, and then going on ahead and following the law, but there's a human driver who's supposed to give way to the autonomous car, but he doesn't stop, or he or she doesn't stop, right? That's gonna, I mean, autonomous cars have to assume that there's going to be fuzzy driver behavior among people around them, and it's arguable whether it should itself be more aggressive, be more fuzzy in its behavior. So should it emulate the humans, or should it seek to not emulate humans? There's also a question of congestion, traffic congestion, right? So a lot of reason why there is congestion on the streets is not because the streets are not wide enough or there's not enough bandwidth for all these cars to travel at the same time, but because humans, when cars clutter together, humans have this tendency to slow down their vehicles. And so that leads to congestion. But autonomous cars need not be programmed with this behavior. Now then that begs the question, are autonomous cars too aggressive when they're all cluttered together? Because they cannot clutter together and go really fast, be really reliable. Humans don't have that capability to go really fast when they see cars all surrounding them. So I think humans, the way I see it is autonomous cars have to be calibrated to understand human behavior, but should that continue ad infinitum? I'm not sure.
Right. There are extreme sort of ethical conundrums that are frequently shared as one sort of corrective or perspective on how fast we're moving. You guys are probably familiar with the trolley problem in philosophy, right? So we have a question from.
Yeah. Okay. Never mind.
Well, feel free to jump in here and respond.
Right.
I mean, so imagine an emergency where a car has to decide in a second or two, right, whether how it's going to get out of this emergency. Is it going to kill the driver? Is it going to kill the pedestrian and save the driver? Is it going to swerve onto the sidewalk and risk killing 20 bystanders in order to save the pedestrian or the driver? You know, who programs how the car responds in that kind of situation, and who's responsible afterwards, right? This is like the extreme case that we need to think about, right?
Well, I think that it's overthought, that the philosophers have gone crazy, or the amateur philosophers. I think the way it's going to be handled, again, is legalistically. There'll be a set of norms that have to be followed, and as long as you've programmed to follow these norms, and my suspicion is that the appropriate norms are going to be to do the best you can without getting outside the range. That is, I am not going to go under the sidewalk. I'm going to stay where I am, even though it sort of means definite death if I stay here. But if I go on the sidewalk, who knows? And the important point is the law is going to figure out, the legislatures, and there has to be standardized across the world, is going to figure out a good course of action that on the average is superior. And even though it may be bad in a few special cases, It's best if we have a standard procedure that everybody follows.
Swarun, did you have to get into any of these types of questions when you were building your prototype systems at MIT?
That is true. I think the way that we sort of handled this is to have a kill switch, right? That just stops the car, and our car had this very clear speed. We didn't drive at 60 miles an hour. It was hardly 15, 20 at best, and we had this kill switch that immediately stops the car no matter what. You're right. Stopping the car in the middle of the street potentially is a bad idea, but it's reasonable. It's the best thing that we can do. It might not work well in all situations, but it's probably the most reasonable thing to do. Now, will this be practical for cars on a highway or in the future? Not at all. So I agree with Don that there should be some well-defined policies for what happens if something goes wrong in different scenarios. These should be codified and applied uniformly for all manufacturers.
Mm-hmm. We have a question coming in from Mary in Warren, Michigan, about the infrastructure that will be required to support fleets of autonomous vehicles. This relates to a question I had as well. One solution would be to instrument the environment. Swarun's already talked a little bit about making street signs and street lights and traffic signs more basically to equip them with sensors so they can share information with cars. That's one solution. I mean, it also strikes me that our world of highways and streets was designed for first for horses and buggies, right? And then was taken over by cars with human drivers. But a world with autonomous vehicles might be one where we'd want to separate pedestrian and vehicle traffic entirely. Why shouldn't the autonomous cars be on, elevated streets or below the street, right? Maybe the problem is we're trying to mix all these kinds of traffic on the same horizontal environment, right? So what do you guys think? How far should we go to remake the environment to accommodate autonomy?
I don't think we have to. All the manufacturers I've talked to and all the places I visit and talk to in the research labs, we're assuming complete autonomy with no infrastructure, because it's going to be too expensive and too impossible to put in infrastructure support. Yeah, it'll be helpful when we have it, but you can't count on it, and therefore the car has to assume not. Moreover, I think that all the points you made about the accidental, if you will, growth of the cities and the streets and the way we accommodate people and vehicles and pedestrians in India, cows and other things, they'll stay. They'll stay. And I think the automated cars will actually deal with it better than today's vehicles. So I think that actually the streets will work okay, because cars can drive closer to each other. They'll be more sensitive to most of the pedestrians. And they'll be stopping. In fact, the danger is that they'll be overly cautious and they won't proceed. Google has fully documented this about how people. Here's what cause of accidents: the car is following the law and being careful, and so the cars behind it get so angry they finally get impatient and they zoom around it, which is dangerous.
Well, right. That gets us right back to an earlier question. In fact, traffic is not entirely law-bound. There are lots of rules that are negotiations, right? And how do robots become more courteous to humans and to each other? How do you program in spontaneous sort of decisions at a corner like that? Really tough stuff is, I guess, my basic point.
I think it's a matter of programming the policies, right? The way I see it is there should be, especially when you have cars which are coexisting with humans, there should be, cars should try to emulate humans to the extent possible, but not completely. In the sense that they should be deferent to humans where possible. But if it's too courteous and it's too slow, this is what will happen, right? You'll cause all the human drivers behind you to be annoyed, or and so on. So there has to be this sort of behavior where you are aware of, okay, there are human vehicles around you, and then try and emulate their behavior where possible. Go with the traffic, go with the flow of the traffic, and not try and be an outlier.
I think that the automation will cause drivers human drivers to become more law-abiding. Because let me tell you this, nobody is going to program a car to violate a law. Even if the law, you know, the speed limit, they'll never go faster than the speed limit. And all the other things, they're going to follow it precisely, even where a normal human would violate it. In fact, one of the issues that's now being discussed, I had a long discussion with one of the companies a couple of weeks ago. There are cases where you have to violate the law, okay? I'm driving down a street and suddenly there's, the street is blocked, a tree has fallen down or something, and I have to drive in the wrong lane in order to get around it, but that's illegal. That's the kind of things, the cases where they're worried about.
Yes.
How do we safely and properly violate the law?
And in fact, here's an example at CMU. So there was this lane tracking system, which makes sure that the autonomous car here is within 2 lanes. But there was one street in which the lanes were marked incorrectly. All right, the street was marked incorrectly, and so then the question was, does the car need to follow the lanes on the street, or does it need to have some intelligence? You know, okay, this is obviously marked incorrectly. So there are a bunch of questions there. So it's not very clear. The law, in some cases, might be defined to be impossible.
Right.
By the way, there's an instance in sailing that has an example in automobile. A sailboat always has right-of-way over an engine-powered boat. But if you're a small sailboat and here comes a great big cruise ship along, boy, I better not say I have the right-of-way, because there's no way that cruise ship can change its direction or stop. And so everybody knows that sailboats do not have the right-of-way when it's a big ship. Well, there was a recent accident with the Google car. The Google car is driving along in the right lane and it wants to turn right. However, there's some construction in the lane, so it has to move to the left lane in order to turn right. And if the Google car looks behind it and says, there's enough space for me to go, there's a human test driver who also looks behind and says, yeah, there's enough space. So it pulls into the left lane and it gets hit by the bus that was behind it. And I thought Google did a wonderful, brilliant job of explaining the accident. They said that it was nobody's fault, that the Google car and the test driver both thought there was enough room, and had that been a normal vehicle, it would have worked. The bus driver, though, said, you know, buses are big, and we don't like to brake fast, and we don't like to brake because we're big and heavy. Same with trucks. And there isn't enough room, and that car should know this. And the bus driver said that the car is waiting for me, clearly. And so that misperception on both sides caused the accident. And so it's caused Google to rethink about, it isn't enough to see how much space there is. You have to look at the kind of vehicle behind you, just like the sailboat is to say, if it's a small, you know, outboard motor, I have the right of way. If it's a great big cruise ship, no, I don't. Well, these are the kind of issues that we have to think about.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, we're almost out of time. We actually are out of time, but I'm going to indulge myself in asking you guys one more question. It's stepping back from this question of how we achieve autonomy or whether we can achieve autonomy, and asking about automobility in general. We have a really great question from Lexa in Maynard, who says, the real question for me is not autonomy or not, but gas guzzling or not. If we're just talking about putting more cars on the road and not addressing sustainability, aren't we just rearranging the rangers on the Titanic?
We're not putting more cars on the road. We're actually making them drive in a more sensible way, which is actually going to reduce gas consumption considerably.
Yes, definitely. Yes, unnecessary braking and so on. A lot of gas consumption is because of those reasons. And also, there's also a human angle to this. There are a lot of people who assume you have fully autonomous cars on the road and you have all the liability issues sorted out. People who are physically challenged, people who are otherwise not able to drive will have now another means of transportation. Now, is it worth being able to provide transportation options to them, or should they be denied means of transportation? So this is an important question to ask. But I would say we should give them the means to be able to transport themselves. And if it costs gas to do that, it's worth it.
Okay. Well, let's just have. Don, I'm sorry, we actually have to wind down, but I was just going to kind of cap off by saying maybe Tesla should be allowed to build electric autonomous cars. Like, let's hope that this new generation of autonomous vehicles is as electric as possible, right?
That's right.
Okay, so thank you both. This has been terrific. So we need to wind this up, and I need to say on behalf of the Alumni Association that we thank our panelists for tuning in today and our audience. We didn't get all the questions out there, and there were a ton of great questions, so we will pass those on to the panelists, and they can respond at their leisure if they're able. And you can tweet about this event using the hashtag MIT alum. You can also send follow-up questions and feedback to alumnilearn@mit.edu. Again, this is Wade Roush from the STS program at MIT saying thank you. Glad you guys could join us today to watch, and hope you'll come back next time. Take care, everybody.
Thanks again for joining us. For more information on future MIT Alumni Association productions, please visit our website.